This is the story of a long-ignored sanctuary, a showcase of nature protected from man by glacial temperatures, giant icebergs, and non-navigable waters. An ocean and lands where for centuries nature has remained virgin. The Arctic of old. The melting of the ice cap has changed things around, opening new sea routes to man. The race for energy resources has begun. The Arctic subsoil is filled with oil. It possibly contains the last great reserve of hydrocarbons in the world.
There's already considerable activity happening in the Arctic, and our report mentions or estimates that perhaps up to $100 billion or more of investment might happen in the next decade.
For oil magnates, this is perhaps the last El Dorado on Earth. 24 million square kilometers north of the Arctic Circle, twice the size of Europe. The United States, Canada, Greenland, Norway, Russia, and all the other neighboring states are staking their claim. They are joined by other, farther afield countries, like China and South Korea, heavy consumers of fossil fuels.
It is surprising to see the outside world just rediscovering the Arctic that fast. And I think that the world is being remapped now, this time with the Arctic. And I think that everybody's eyes are focusing on the Arctic.
Pumping oil in such a cold climate is a big risk, much bigger than elsewhere. The Arctic is as fragile a world as it is harsh.
If there's an oil spill in broken ice, I don't care what anybody says, I can say that there is absolutely no way human beings can deal with oil in broken ice. Can't happen.
The black gold rush is threatening more than the waters. To drill at sea, you must build gigantic facilities on dry land, where today, due to climate change, the melting of the ice cap endangers any form of construction. Dangers that hang over the Arctic of tomorrow, far from our sight, with no public consultation. The Arctic's fate is now in the hands of Washington, Beijing, or Moscow, beyond the vision even of the head offices of the major oil companies. Moscow was the first out of the starting blocks in the race for the Arctic in 2007, a classic case of manipulating public opinion, Putin style. At first, it was a simple scientific expedition aiming to do what no one had ever done, to set foot on the ocean floor 4,000 meters beneath the North Pole. This mind-boggling project was headed by Russian oceanographer Anatoly Sagelevich. At the time, few people were interested in the Arctic.
The whole expedition was organized without a single ruble from the state budget. Russia didn't invest anything.
It took Sagelevich almost 10 years to get together the money from private backers alone. On July 28, 2007, he and his team finally dived beneath the North Pole.
Mir 1 to Fedorov, depth of 4,000 meters, 260 meters to go.
They would only stay for a few minutes on the seabed beneath the pole, but a few minutes were enough for Sagelevich to immortalize his feat.
Okay, the Russian flag is planted at the North Pole.
The flag? That was my idea to plant it at the North Pole. And why not? When people climb Mount Everest, they plant their country's flag. We were there first, so we planted our flag.
Footage of the Russian flag under the North Pole was seen around the world. The following day, President Putin hijacked the scientific expedition, claiming it was part of a Russian national project. The Arctic suddenly became a main stage of international geopolitics.
We all owe a debt of gratitude to Russia for planting a flag at the seabed of the North Pole that brought attention to the Arctic like few other stunts ever have. It was an attention getter, and it caused a lot of people in the United States and elsewhere to start thinking more seriously about the Arctic region.
But what was the Russian government looking for north of the Arctic Circle? The answer to that would come a year later. In July 2008, the renowned U.S. Geology Survey published an influential report on the potential hydrocarbon reserves in the Arctic, stating that the subsoil harbored a real treasure.
Hello and welcome to USGS Corecast. I'm Jessica Robertson. There is an estimated 90 billion barrels of undiscovered, technically recoverable oil in the Arctic.
This will be the first ever publicly available resource estimate of petroleum resources, that is oil, gas, and natural gas liquids, of all areas north of the Arctic Circle. These resources account for about 22% of the undiscovered, technically recoverable resources in the world.
It has been clearly proven that the Arctic has considerable resources. Until now, they have been difficult to access and have required heavy investment. This is why large numbers of prospecting projects were unprofitable. But the rise in the price of oil these past 20 or 30 years has changed things. The barrel is now at over $100, which now makes most of these projects potentially profitable.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are now approaching Ido Descent. Please hold the table up, turn and grab position and fast.
Prospecting projects are becoming all the more potentially profitable as access is made easier by climate change and the melting of the ice cap. Glaciers are retreating everywhere, like here on the west coast of Greenland, where scientists have been able to measure the change.
We have scientific recordings quite far back. This is the inland ice, this is the sea, and here is Ilulissat. And what we know is today the glacier front is about here, and 6,000 years ago we had it all the way out here next to town, actually. And then it retreated until about 1850 to this area here, about half the way in. And then it went till about the 60s and stayed quite stable at this point for several years. And what happened then was that suddenly we lost 12 kilometers of ice within a decade.
The Arctic region is changing right before our eyes. Most of this change is as a result of the warming climate. And mostly, this is bad news. The sea levels are rising, the land glaciers and the sea ice is melting. At the same time, the changes are bringing about new opportunities. There's the possibility of oil and gas development in places where it never existed before.
Today, oil and gas multinationals are investing billions of dollars into exploration and drilling north of the Arctic Circle. Russian giant Gazprom is already drilling at Prirazlomnoye, the first commercial offshore oil development in the Arctic. Rosneft is signing partnership contracts by the dozen. BP, Shell, Exxon, Statoil. All the oil majors all want their piece of the pie.
And so it is really this effort for exploration around the world which has led gradually the oil companies to go from easy parts onshore to the harsh climates, hot, cold, onshore, over the last century, gradually going offshore to shallow waters, 50 meters, 100 meters. The amount of oil to be produced from the Arctic, or the amount of oil from the new discoveries expected in the Arctic region, could be estimates vary from 4, 5, 6, or 8 million barrels per day. And that will be significant.
8 million barrels a day. That's twice the production of ExxonMobil, the biggest private oil company in the world. The conquest of the Arctic has now become an affair of state for neighboring countries.
The bottom line is this. Given our energy needs, in order to sustain economic growth and produce jobs and keep our businesses competitive, we are going to need to harness traditional sources of fuel even as we ramp up production of new sources of renewable homegrown energy. So today we're announcing the expansion of offshore oil and gas exploration. That's why we'll continue to support development of leased areas off the North Slope of Alaska while protecting Alaska's Bristol Bay.
Countries only have the right to develop oil fields within their own frontiers. Until now, the Arctic has had imprecise borders. Today, countries are seeking to redefine them for their own benefit. Claiming extra territory means increasing your chance of discovering new oil fields. The former USSR was the first to claim a large part of the Arctic Ocean. That was almost 90 years ago, when Stalin ruled the Rus.
For many years, we called it Soviet Arctic. Everything was laid out simply. Here, from the Murmansk region towards the North Pole, we traced one line, and a second line went to Cape Dezhnev. All of this territory was recognized as belonging to the Soviet Union, according to a ruling by the Soviet government in 1926, I believe. And so, when the Soviet Union gave this ruling, no other state protested, because it was 1926.
In effect, back then, nobody imagined that the Arctic was rich in black gold. For over 80 years, Russia considered this territory as its private hunting ground. Today, it is pleading its case for the United Nations to acknowledge its sovereignty. But other neighboring countries are now claiming their own territories around the North Pole.
Since 2007, the Danes have also been working actively in their zone to the north of Greenland. I must say that they're well situated because Greenland is the closest country to the North Pole. Canada also has reasons to claim sovereignty over this zone. In my opinion, we need to reach an international agreement to trace a radius from this point, the North Pole, and to recognize that this area belongs to all mankind.
Most experts advocate making the North Pole the status an international zone, but not everyone agrees.
A Russian researcher suggests that the Arctic should be transferred under the control of the international community.
What an idiot.
Your stance on this?
I already said it. The Arctic is definitely part of the Russian Federation. It has been under our sovereignty for several centuries, and it will remain so forever. And we should not forget that American submarines are positioned just off the Norwegian coast. American missiles could reach Moscow within 16 to 17 minutes.
As if to confirm the fears of the Russian president, NATO holds regular military exercises in the region. "10,000 soldiers from 15 different countries train close to the Russian Federation's border. The code name of these maneuvers, Cold Response. "20 years after the end of the Cold War, the Arctic has become a territory to defend. It's no longer a case of ideological combat, but of financial interests."
Ladies and gentlemen, our final event this morning is in progress. It will be an opposed boarding of the Coast Guard vessel Harstad by Naval Special Operations Forces.
Meanwhile, the Russians are preparing to step up their military presence in the region.
I ask you to work particularly hard in deploying military units in the Arctic. Russia is increasing more and more its presence in the region, so we must employ all possible means to ensure our security and to protect national interests.
In the Arctic, protecting national interests is primarily about securing oil fields and the transport of black gold. So while waiting for the Russian military to carry out President Putin's orders, everyone is obliged to cooperate. In the Barents Sea, where industrial developments are the most numerous. Here, only the Russian and Norwegian military are capable of intervening in case of a problem. So they're learning to work together, without forgetting to revamp their weapons.
Fire! The Arctic, it's a gold mine for many. And where it's gold, I think criminals are heading for it. I fear that big criminal organizations can use submarine if they want. They're using car bombs, they're using human bombs. They can also hit oil industry. It's very vital that we also acting with exercise like this.
How you doing? Moscow, what's your name?
I'm Sergei.
Okay.
We have a good contact. It's just a shame about the language barrier. It would be nice to talk more about these things with them. We'd like to do these exercises more often. Now that all the barriers of the Cold War have come down, things have got more back to normal.
The main thing is to get the Norwegian and the Russian military to work together. So we have a common understanding about working together, like we do now, from vessel to vessel.
The teams will train together for a week, but only on board Norwegian ships. The Russians have forbidden their teammates from coming aboard their own vessels.
Communication is the key here to get things to work. All right, very good. We're all safe and can sail on to the next serial. All right, thank you very much.
They are learning to fight together against fires, storms, and even pirates. However, on a political level, cooperation is much less smooth. Kiruna, May 15, 2013. This small Swedish town on the northern border with Norway is not used to flurries of diplomatic activity. But today, under tight security, it is hosting a meeting of the Arctic Council, a forum created in 1991 by 8 countries bordering the North Pole. The Council is independent of any international authority, even the UN. The present and future of the Arctic depends solely on it. As proof of its importance, U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry and his Russian counterpart Sergei Lavrov are in attendance. Representatives from the great powers, emerging nations, and the major oil companies are all present. But not the European Union. Here, the EU's standpoints on ecological matters are considered too restrictive. There is only Michel Rocard, French ambassador to the poles, representing symbolically the old continent.
Good morning, and we now start the formal meeting, the 8th ministerial meeting of the Arctic Council. I think I do like that in order to be formal.
I'm pleased that President Obama, just a few days ago, released the U.S. national strategy for the Arctic region, reaffirming that a secure and well-managed Arctic marked by international cooperation and conflict, an absence of conflict, is a key policy priority of the United States.
Still more decisions are having consequences for countries far away from the Arctic. It's therefore quite natural that we see China, India, South Korea and others knocking on our door.
The unique ecological.
So it's just like anybody else in this world. We know that today even Singapore is. So I saw on the web asking a question whether Arctic has anything to do with Singapore. And then Singaporean, in answering this question, yes, why not? We can also join in these efforts to come to Arctic to take a look and to maybe to make use of Arctic.
Our nations.
Apparently, the perspectives look promising. It's been 6 years since China started requesting a seat on the Arctic Council. This year, it finally succeeds. China obtains the status of observer after a long night of negotiations. Russia, which was opposed, has had to yield. Its Minister of Foreign Affairs finds it hard to conceal his disappointment.
Today, we welcome those who receive the status of observers.
And I think this is a wise decision. So it's a result we are expecting for quite a long time.
And as for Europe, it is still kept out of things. As long as it refuses to relax its ecological legislation, for example its ruling on seal hunting, the doors to the Arctic Council remain firmly closed.
The European Union applied for membership 3 years ago, but was turned down. So we're not fully at ease with the running of the Council, which is like a joint ownership committee and not a synthesis of the ideas of neighboring states and other users of the Arctic.
And as often on joint ownership committees, the general interest is ignored. Neighbors agree between themselves in the name of individual interests. Here in Kiruna, the council members have finally signed a cooperation agreement in case of an oil spill in the sea. But it's an empty shell. It provides for no common rules. Each nation can act as it pleases on its territory without being answerable to its neighbors.
Some people have advocated for a common set of standards for the regulation of oil and gas development throughout the Arctic. For the time being, though, each country still has the right to regulate oil and gas development as it sees fit. And there are differing standards throughout the Arctic. That is true.
There need to be rules, if possible, common rules. Whereas at the moment, it's each to his own. Same for oil and gas. Everyone is prospecting and drilling in their own territory and not obeying collective rules because they don't exist. Nothing, and that's terrifying.
No Arctic mining! No Arctic mining!
Terrifying, the current prospecting in the Arctic Ocean. The Gulf of Mexico disaster has already shown us the possible consequences of an accident. April 2010, BP's Deep Horizon oil platform caught fire, exploded, and collapsed. The accident caused the greatest oil pollution in the history of the United States. 11 deaths and 800 million liters of oil spilled into the sea. It took 6,000 ships and 50,000 people to try to limit the damage from the gigantic oil slick. What if such a disaster were to strike in the Arctic, in the freezing temperatures of the polar ice, hundreds of kilometers from the nearest port? No country in the region would have the technical or human means to react.
We've seen a number of relatively small incidents in the Arctic recently. Unfortunately, they haven't been on the scale of, say, a Macondo incident. My worry is that one day we could see an event on that scale, and we simply don't know what the impact would be on the Arctic, other than being catastrophic. That's my concern.
Neil Smith is no idealist ecologist. He's emerging risks manager for the biggest insurance market in the world, Lloyd's of London. A large number of industrial companies investing in the Arctic are insured here. After the highly costly Gulf of Mexico accident, Neil Smith commissioned a study on the potential risks in the Arctic.
When I commissioned this report on the Arctic, we were very keen, and I was very keen personally, and Lloyd's as an organisation, just to raise awareness of these particular issues in the Arctic, both the climate change and the potential consequences of a disaster, what that would mean for the Arctic. What surprised me the most was just the level or lack of knowledge in the Arctic in certain areas. And while this activity, increasing economic activity is going on, there's huge unknowns as to how it will develop in the future. Within the Lloyd's report, we highlight the wide range of different risks that companies face in operating in the Arctic, from obvious operational risks given the extreme environment, the very cold weather, the shortness of the summer, the changing conditions, through to potential financial risks and reputational risks if a major incident were to happen in the Arctic.
The alert is exceptional. It's the first time that a major business organization raised its voice against the risk of industrial exploitation in the Arctic. Despite the warning reported by the media, oil companies are continuing the rush for black gold. A few months later, a mobile rig owned by Shell ran aground off the coast of Alaska.
That was their model drill ship to drill into Chukchi Sea, that they were simply trying to tow to Seattle for some repairs that they lost a tow on in a Gulf of Alaska storm in December, which is what happens in the Gulf of Alaska in much of the Northern Hemisphere in December. Nobody was killed, nobody was seriously injured, but it showed, the colossal failures that Shell exhibited in 2012, even with this intense scrutiny by government and civil society, shows that they don't have their act together.
Rick Steiner has been studying oil spill accidents and the consequences on the environment for 20 years.
And Shell, they're such cowboys, such bravado and such arrogant. They thought they could do it without any oversight. They just wanted government and the citizens out of their way. Don't worry, little people, we can do this with little risk. No matter how carefully they say they're doing Arctic drilling, we know there will be residual risk of a catastrophic blowout. They don't have adequate, and if there is a blowout, they will not be able to contain it effectively. If they won't be able to collect the oil off the sea surface, particularly in broken ice situations.
Here, the people of Alaska know full well the damage that oil can cause. The beaches still bear the scars.
So, a week ago, I was out with a student, and we were looking for residual oil.
Oh, go in video.
You can see the oil droplets coming down as we were digging down into the pit. It's messy work. You can see it just all turned black with the oil. There's, it's on a layer of water, and this is a little absorbent material for cleaning oil spills.
Oil has been polluting Alaskan beaches for 25 years. One night in March 1989, a giant oil spill spread across Prince William Sound. Until this day, it is one of the worst ecological disasters in American history.
Just minutes after midnight on Good Friday, March 24th, 1989, the 987-foot supertanker Exxon Valdez, carrying 53 million gallons of North Slope crude oil, inexplicably ran aground at Bligh Reef in Prince William Sound.
wife and I rented a plane. She was pregnant at the time, and we wanted to go see what our future might look like. And I remember the depression of that flight, that the oil was, it was phenomenal amounts of oil everywhere. And we knew then that our lives had been changed forever, that it really wasn't good. It couldn't be the same with that much oil in the water. That's the way we felt. So it felt like the world was dying around us.
Oil spilled from the Exxon tanker for days on end. The whole population was mobilized to clean up the coast. It was spring, at the height of the fish breeding season. The mayor of Cordova demanded that Exxon come up with a rescue plan. 4 days after the catastrophe, official representatives from the oil company finally met with victims.
This was my wife's video camera, and so we went, and I just filmed the whole meeting. I felt it was obligatory to do that. Not had many hits. I'm surprised, you know. That's me there.
Prince William Sound was beautiful a week ago, and now it's full of shit.
Don Cornett would like to follow up on that particular statement.
You have had some good luck, and you don't realize it. You have Exxon, and we do business straight. We will consider whatever it takes to keep you whole.
All right.
Put it on paper and bring it to the table. See if you can't fish, or you don't do the herring fishery this year, bring it to the table. But standing and yelling.
The herring fishery this year, we haven't had any herring fishery since the oil spill, really, you know. And this was half my income back before the oil spill. I mean, so to lose half your income, bang, just like that, makes it kind of tough.
My family, as an example, we still own 2 herring permits. And it was a pretty modest income. We used to earn between $28,000 and $30,000 a year from as revenue. But it was our startup money. But if you add up all of that together in 20 lost seasons and you got $600,000, that's what it cost me.
A lot of those guys just hung it up. They couldn't go out and lose money, you know. Unfortunately, I got caught up in that to some degree. My wife and I got divorced. I sold the boat because I just couldn't make my payments, and you know, that was it. I mean, that was my dream ended because of this corrupt corporation that you know, came to visit us in '89.
4 years after the drama, the mayor of the small city took his own life. His suicide note read, "The stress from Exxon was too much to deal with alone. I wish I could have done more good for others, but I guess my time is up."
Once you find the oil, it smells. You know, it's fresh enough that it smells like crude oil. Boy, you sealed that one well. White shirt. I don't know if you smell that, but you know, it's one of those things where this is from 2008. You know, in this case, kind of like peanut butter.
We have a pretty long winter where things get frozen out there. And so the bacterial degradation rates of oil and hydrocarbons and pollutants is generally diminished. A quarter of a century after this one dump of oil into a coastal ecosystem, many seals became blind. Birds and otters were incorporating this toxic hydrocarbon into their body systems by feeding. Reproductive rates were changed, behaviors, distribution, everything. Most of the impacted populations are still struggling to recover. Some are not recovering at all. My view, as a scientist who has worked in Prince William Sound years, is that Prince William Sound will never fully recover from the impacts of the Exxon Valdez oil spill.
Is Exxon Shipping Company prepared to reimburse commercial fishermen for the lost income from fisheries?
I have a great deal of knowledge of how Exxon settles their claims, and I guarantee you we have never had a claim go 20 years. The answer to the question is no. The claims will be settled promptly.
The representative of Exxon was almost telling the truth. The trial didn't go on for 20 years, but for 19. In February 2008, the Supreme Court of the United States gave its final judgment with no possibility for appeal. The ExxonMobil Corporation would have to pay fishermen only 10% of the $5 billion originally awarded in damages by the Court of Alaska.
I think the lesson that you learn is if you're big enough and powerful enough, you can bring the system to a halt, and that's what's happened here. And as a representative of the system, I feel badly about that, and I told the fishermen over the course of the last 12 or 13 years, I've apologized to them for the system.
So we're about $540,000 out. The good news is we still hear about getting checks. I just received yesterday, you'll love this, a letter from the Exxon settlement group. These are the administrators of the legal payments back, and I have one more check coming for my herring business. They're going to send me a check for $340.58, and that will be the last check that I get. By limiting liability for these kinds of corporate acts, what they did was allow corporations to do the mathematics. They can now predict exactly how much their dangerous conduct of business will cost them. And if it costs less to do it badly than it would to do it the correct way, they can now calculate that and do their business badly. It's a sad, sad, sad state, yeah.
The city of Cordova itself only gained one thing. Under pressure from public opinion, the U.S. Congress installed here a center specializing in oil spills in Arctic and subarctic seas.
We want to help understand what the impacts are, but also be able to develop new technologies to improve our ability to respond to oil spills.
Scott Pigou also wants to establish the truth. The oil companies systematically overestimate their capacities to clean up polluted areas.
What is our ability to recover oil in the open water? You know, we typically get about 8% of an oil spill is recovered, is a typical number. A very good recovery is around 20%. So, you know, anyone that tells you we're going to pick up everything they're not telling you the truth. It depends on the time of year a spill would occur, that if it occurred in the fall when you're losing light, you have bad weather. The realism is that there's likely to end up having to track it through the winter and look for it in the spring.
In winter, it's dark 24/7 in the Arctic. Pretty much impossible to localize oil trapped in the drift ice that spreads over hundreds of kilometers. The estimate of 8% seems very optimistic. French major Total thinks it's too risky to drill beneath the ice flow.
Total's position on the Arctic is very clear. The Arctic interests us. It's a region we're ready to prospect in, except for drilling for oil under the ice flow. That's the only thing we refuse to do. The reason for that is that it seems difficult, if not impossible, today to control accidents, pollution and oil spills in the Arctic. The impact on our company would be equal to that of our competitor in the Gulf of Mexico a few years ago. It nearly brought down an oil company that was much bigger and more renowned than ours is today.
To date, Total is the only oil major not to prospect beneath the ice. It's perhaps also why it was the only major which agreed to be interviewed.
Having said that, we are allowing ourselves to prospect for and produce oil away from the ice flow, by which I mean on dry land and in the open sea.
Frozen open sea, like in the Gulf of Alaska where the Exxon Valdez disaster happened? Why leave such decisions to oil companies alone? Why do nations intervene so little?
The industry is so powerful everywhere. In Russia and Norway and Nigeria, they are so powerful that government is controlled by industry, even if they don't know they're being controlled by industry. And so the industry has a way of co-opting and corrupting government policy. And they're very good at it. They're very strategic about it, and they usually get what they want. What we need is strong leaders in government and civil society that see that and know that their job, the main job of government, is to protect the citizens, not to protect the interests and the financial bottom line of the oil companies.
That's what the population of Greenland was hoping for at the last election in March 2013. The undersea deposits of this island, an autonomous country within the Kingdom of Denmark, is drawing the major oil companies from across the globe. Drilling has even begun. But Greenlanders are afraid that the oil companies are concealing the true risks of drilling under the ice flow. They elected Aleqa Hammond as prime minister. Her campaign included a more prudent approach to oil company projects and advocated their re-examination.
Are we ready for oil tomorrow? Are we ready for the non-living resources income that we're coming with today? Or when do we feel that we're ready? What does our legislation say? What does the parliament say? What does the government say? I think it's important that the society of Greenland make a decision to be the winner of the decision that are we going to make.
First in line are the fishermen who account for 90% of the country's export revenue. Oil companies assure them that they have nothing to fear. But the country's fishermen aren't prepared to take the oil majors' word.
In connection to the vibrations and movements of oil ships, it is very likely that fish and marine mammals will suffer. That's very likely. Well, I can ask her that they absolutely have to involve the fishermen and hunters in their outward political messages. That is, they have to get information from the fishermen. What do you think? Or unions such as KNAPK, Hunters and Fishermen's Union in Greenland, ask them how oil activities may impact the fisheries and include the fishermen and the unions in the discussion, all of the discussions.
The fishermen know that navigating in Arctic waters is risky business. Even in summer, there are icebergs to cope with.
Of course, one has to be careful of these icebergs, because sometimes they roll over and destroy ships. That can be very dangerous. That's just how it is, but for right now, it's all good. If we say that there were to be oil exploration or exploitation, there would be many big ships, and there are many icebergs in this area. So if they hit an iceberg, or get damaged otherwise, and there is an oil spill, as I've mentioned, it can have severe consequences on the community.
What about those who don't live off fishing? They see oil money as manna from heaven that will reboost the local economy. Like here in Asiat. This town of 3,000 inhabitants dreams of having a large port, a future technical base for oil and gas prospecting.
They have done a little work up there. The oil companies have worked in Asiat, more or less. Aasiaat, because of its natural harbor and relatively low country, it's one of the lowest in Greenland, one of the flattest in Greenland. People are very much interested in it, yes. Building a quay, making roads, and another thing that would be needed would be more hotels, more beds. So we would need a local workforce to build and construct these things, and that would be great.
Jobs and money, that's what the oil industry would bring to Greenland. And the majors have agreed to pay the country 59% of the income earned here.
This is the center of the world? Greenland is in the center? No, I'm just kidding.
Jørgen Hameken Holm is head of the Greenland Bureau of Minerals and Petroleum.
We have done some calculations on the income if there's going to be any discoveries. Yes, we have done that, and the numbers are very high.
That's quite simple. We need some income, and especially if you want a country that is independent, like most people want it to be. It's obvious that many people dream of this big earnings from oil.
The money would help Greenland to say no to the €500 million that Denmark pays in order to retain it in its kingdom. It could then claim its much-dreamed-of independence, surely enough to forget electoral promises. Early 2014, the government of Greenland awarded new licenses to prospect for oil off of its northeast coast, an ice flow region with extreme climatic conditions.
Our parents' time fought for home rule government, and our time we fought for self-rule. Our next generation has to fight for independence.
Yeah, well, my major concern as a site manager of a World Heritage Site is, of course, if you have an oil spill like the one in Alaska or in the Mexican Gulf, what will happen to our site here? Because my job is to protect that site, so it shouldn't be damaged for the future generations. Nobody have given any guarantees.
Greenlanders are faced with a tricky decision. 1, to suspend oil production and compromise all hope of independence and a higher standard of living. 2, keep the oil projects going and run major risks for the environment. It's a hard choice for all the countries in the Arctic region. Some of them don't even ask the question, like Russia. Here, the economy of the entire country and thus the legitimacy of its government depends on hydrocarbons. Revenues from oil and gas account for almost half of national tax income. They guarantee a certain standard of living for an entire population. But Russian reserves in the region are starting to decline, while just off the northern coast lie over half of the Arctic's oil and gas reserves. So it's no surprise that Vladimir Putin himself should launch the battle for polar black gold.
Today, Russia truly begins to exploit resources in the Arctic. We are starting a new chapter in Arctic exploration.
In 2011, the Russian major Gazprom installed the first industrial drilling platform at Prirazlomnoye in the Arctic.
Deputy Prime Minister Sechin and the CEOs of Rosneft and Gazprom struck oil and got a personal call from Vladimir Putin.
How much oil will the platform produce per year?
Up to 6.5 million tons per year.
Behind the public certitudes lies a much less reassuring reality. The Prirazlomnoye rig, since its installation, has constantly had to delay its first production due to technical problems. Its safety system worries a good number of experts. Bellona, the only Russian NGO to specialize in industrial risks in the Arctic, is concerned about the lack of transparency from the Russian oil giant.
The Prirazlomnaya rig has been there quite some time. They could have at least organized a visit. They could have invited observers and explained what they're doing. That would have been very useful.
But Gazprom is in a hurry and has only one ambition: to be the first to pump offshore oil in the Russian Arctic. At Prirazlomnaya, ecologists and other so-called spoil sports are not welcome. In September 2013, activists from Greenpeace launched a lightning operation, as they do regularly across the globe and even in Russia over the past 20 years. As usual, the operation was filmed by the activists themselves. Activists in the sights of guns, warning shots. The reaction of Russian security forces was particularly aggressive.
Guns have been put back in holster, over.
Frankly, Greenpeace did not expect the level of response that we got this year. The question of why the Greenpeace experience in Russia this year in 2013 versus the decades we've worked there in the past, why it was so different, is a really important one.
Arctic Sunrise, you stop your vessel or heave to. If you don't do this, this is Russian Coast Guard ship. I suspect you in terrorism. In terrorism? I'm sending an inspection party to you. I'm sending an inspection party to you.
All who took part in the operation are arrested. Thrown in jail, they are threatened with 15 years behind bars. Never before had the Russian authorities gone so far. But Greenpeace had touched the very heart of the Putin system and the guarantee of its survival in the future: oil production in the Arctic.
It's as if Russia had decided to punish Greenpeace as an example. It's absurd to think of the Greenpeace operation as proof that the whole world is against Russia. I think the authorities are using this incident to build Russian nationalism. We're creating hatred in our people against the rest of the world, which is only acting according to its principles and doesn't see such an act as criminal. Whereas in Russia, people think we should ban everything and not let people in.
Did they want to intimidate Greenpeace, or did they want to intimidate any non-Russian actor to say we don't respond to external, to external influences? And I think that's a question that now anybody who deals with Russia, whether it's Greenpeace or the European Union or an international oil company, is going to have to make that assessment for themselves.
After 3 months in jail, the Greenpeace activists were given an amnesty by Vladimir Putin and were finally released. Their icebreaker, Arctic Sunrise, was confiscated by the Russian authorities. Greenpeace has been banned from entering Russian Arctic waters. For Gazprom and its partners, it's business as usual. From Norwegian major Statoil to American Shell via French Total, all continue to work with Russian companies. Because the race for new deposits is imperative for an oil or gas company, its share price depends on 2 parameters alone: production and reserves.
Oil companies everywhere going to areas which are difficult to explore and produce, but they still go there in order to secure discoveries and reserves. So although they may think that they would not bring those discoveries into production next year or the year after, but the fact that they have made those discoveries and in their records they have increased their reserves, and therefore their shareholders will be happy that they have the potential of future production and revenue.
When BP signed an agreement with Rosneft, if I'm not mistaken, the company's share price rose by $5 or $6 billion in a few days.
And this contradiction of the nature of the industry being long-term and this pressure from shareholders and the media and so on, wanting short-term performance by these oil companies, short-term financial performance, has been a dilemma and a problem for the management of the oil industry.
The Arctic is the last El Dorado on the planet for the oil companies. The only region, thanks to its huge reserves, where they can immediately increase their company's value and boost production. And global warming makes things easier for them. Arctic oil could be transported by tankers on waters free of ice directly to their purchasers. This is what the Russian giant is already doing with its very unique oil terminal installed in the middle of the Arctic Ocean.
I think that anyone seeing such a construction for the first time would be flabbergasted. It's unique in the world. Varanday is the only oil terminal in the whole of the Arctic Ocean. I was very impressed by it.
Varanday Oil Terminal is a platform to be built in the Arctic Ocean in an area that's totally frozen over for half the year. Lukoil exploits on-land reservoirs along the coast of the Barents Sea. But rather than build miles and miles of pipelines, it has chosen maritime transport. Since the seabed is not very deep, the terminal was built 22 kilometers offshore. The crude oil is brought in via undersea pipes, and tankers arrive to load up at sea. The terminal has been operational since 2008 and without incident so far. In the Arctic, weather conditions can be extreme. You need to learn to have patience.
Wait till there's a northwesterly wind. Then we'll shift position so the angle of the drift is nearer to the bow.
The weather's bad. The load was swinging from 40 to 90 tons, and the maximum load is 120 tons, after which an alarm goes off. When the load on the mooring rope reaches critical level, we have to pull away and wait for the weather to calm down. We probably could have done it, but it was too hard to control the position of the bow. The waves might have taken us too far from the terminal, and we might have lost the feeder pipe. And that pipe costs over $1 million.
It's blinking, so the hatches are closed. There's the close signal. The line's assembled. We're ready to go. We'll load 70,000 tons of crude. It usually takes 12 hours, 12 and a half hours max, if we maintain the same rate.
Once loaded, the tanker can sail directly to Asian countries, which are huge consumers of oil. It's the shortest and thus fastest route.
One of my dreams is to take the Northern Sea route to Japan or China and back. I'd love to do that. It could really come true. Our company is evolving, and oil companies are building more and more platforms in the Arctic.
But his ship heads west on a much surer route. As incredible as it may seem, there are no existing maritime charts of the Northern Sea route.
The charts that exist date from the Soviet era, notably after the Second World War. They mainly map routes close to the coast. The coast and this thin strip. That's why captains who are experienced in Arctic navigation only take these routes and know they must never stray too far from them.
Oil and methane tankers can't sail along the coast as the sea is too shallow for them. But farther north, the melting of the ice flow has created new routes now authorized for navigation by Russian authorities.
Last year, my employees gave me some very strange reports. They went on an expedition north of the Novosibirsk Islands. Where the new officially charted routes are for ships with a draft 12 to 14 meters. That's to say, like tankers. On these routes, where the depth is believed to be 20 to 25 meters, my interns found places with a depth of only 8 to 10 meters. So navigation on these routes isn't as safe as it's claimed.
The hull of a tanker isn't as strong as that of an icebreaker. It would be very bad for a tanker to take the ground.
In 2011, Captain Igor Pankov was on board the first trial run for a tanker to China via the Northern Sea route. A highly risky journey with no real charts of the seabeds.
We had charts, of course, but there was no data on them, with practically no depth information. To give you an idea, a large part of the region north of the Novosibirsk Islands had only one measurement per 100 square kilometers. Imagine a square 10 by 10 kilometers and only one measurement made in the middle. You don't know when it was made. All you know is the depth is between 25 and 30 meters. And you've no idea of the depth all the way around.
The company given the task of mapping the Arctic seas in detail gave us some terrifying details. They explained that for them to do a proper job, despite the 5 ships working on it, it would take 200 years.
A job made all the more titanic by the fact that the ocean floor is made up of frozen land which is in constant movement.
The floor of the Arctic Ocean is very complex. Sometimes the frozen bed comes up to the surface, forming islands of ice, which often change positions. Then it disappears after a certain amount of time, only to reappear somewhere else.
It's most likely that the sea charts were made before the islands appeared. They're a direct danger to navigation, but notably for oil tankers.
Attention, all crew members. Training exercise for an onboard oil spill. The source of the spill is to starboard, near to the manifold. Training exercise for an onboard oil spill. The source of the spill is to starboard, near to the manifold. The first thing to do is prevent the oil from spilling into the sea. So to contain it on board, then neutralize it. If we are unable to contain an onboard spill and oil drains into the sea, we have no equipment, no means at all to deal with that.
There is a warning system. We inform our vessel's flag state and the state whose waters the oil has spilled into. Then, they organize an operation to neutralize the slick.
To transport oil through the Russian Arctic, estimates say it would take between 750 and 1,100 tanker journeys a year. That's a huge increase compared to today's traffic. That means that in Russia, the organizations charged with dealing with oil spills must prepare themselves very seriously for this situation.
In the Arctic, any oil slick would be at least 7 or 8 days sailing from the nearest port. In fact, there's only Murmansk. From Norway to the Bering Strait is 6,000 kilometers, and there are 3 ports. 3. That means 1 every 2,000 kilometers. So an intervening ship would need 5 or 6 days' worth of supplies, perhaps more, before reaching another port.
A crazy, carefree attitude at sea, on land, and in the ports. We're in Murmansk in northwest Russia at the most imposing oil terminal in the Russian Arctic. Here, an ancient 30-year-old tanker serves as an oil reservoir. Its hull is only 1 layer thick. This is strictly forbidden by international law. Even a very light collision while mooring could fracture the hull and send hundreds of tons of oil spilling into the sea.
Ban this tanker. They wouldn't do it, for financial reasons. The ship has already been paid for, it's still afloat. So why ban it? That would mean losing the revenue from several millions of tons of oil transfers. That's too much money to lose.
The port of Murmansk is key to the Grand Russian plan of developing the Northern Sea Route, which runs alongside the country to Asia. This route was very active during the Soviet era, but was abandoned after the collapse of the USSR in 1991. Russia wants to revive it. It would reduce by over 50% the transport time from Europe to Asia. The economic stakes are immense. Who will control the traffic? Who will pay rights of passage? Who will reap the profits? Russia claims the rights of the Northeastern Passage, while Canada claims sovereignty over the Northwest Passage.
There are disputes. The Canadians claim the Northwest Passage is theirs. The Americans get angry and say no way. It's an international shipping lane.
Yes, Canada and the United States have agreed to disagree about the status of the waters known as the Northwest Passage. From Canada's perspective, these are internal waters, and that ships other than Canadian ships can only pass through there with the consent of Canada. The United States and most other governments who have spoken to the matter see this passageway as similar to the Straits of Gibraltar.
Canada says, no way, we're responsible for security, safety, rescues, etc. Which is funny, because Canada speaks out loud, but it only has one polar icebreaker. It says, it's our sovereignty, so we'll handle safety. And we'll underline this sovereignty with a military presence. And it only has 2 warships able to cope with polar ice and icebergs. The only real force in the Arctic is Russia. Russia doesn't scream out, Russia acts. But basically, it supports the Canadian position, all that should be dealt with internally, but it gets the rest of the world screaming.
This political jousting masks a much greater and very real threat. To find, extract, and transport oil or gas from the Arctic, roads, ports, power stations, and towns will need to be built. So many infrastructures built on top of the permafrost, the Arctic soil made so unstable due to global warming.
The permafrost is a layer of frozen soil that's everywhere in the Arctic. And the permafrost has meant that we, for many years, have been able to build, for example, houses and construct roads or airports on soil without proper fundamenting. But what happens now is that the permafrost is melting, or at least it's going further down because of the warmer temperatures. So you will see our roads, they're quite bumpy now. So this is something that nobody thought about maybe 100 or 200 years ago, but now, yeah, we have problems.
This phenomenon has been studied for years by the scientific community across almost all of the Arctic. The situation is worsening. Researchers are sounding the alarm, but the industrialists don't seem too bothered.
Look at the state of this road. It was only built 2 years ago, and see how it is today. All the pipes have been ripped out. There's no hope of it holding. In 2011, it broke in 68 different places. This year, in over 300. It will take a huge amount of money to repair.
Now this permafrost is warmer, so your foundation is not able to support the structural weight. So what happens? You have deformations and collapses of buildings, pipelines, and there are many different issues.
These deformations quickly cause cracks. Many of us remember the disaster in Bely-Kamen in Siberia, when people died during their lunch break, when reinforced concrete piles built only 10 years before just collapsed on top of them.
Valery Ivanovich, you're a wonderful storyteller. You've told us some horrible things, but is there light at the end of the tunnel?
The ground is changing too fast in urbanized areas.
The melting of the permafrost concerns nearly all industrial sites, but there's one that nobody ever mentions, despite the fact that even a minor accident there would have irreparable consequences. Arctic Russia is home to the only nuclear plant in the world to be built on permafrost, Bilibino, north of the Arctic Circle and of the same generation as Chernobyl.
1973. The building of a nuclear power plant on the permafrost in Bilibino.
These are the only images of Bilibino, a site that has been strictly off-limits for 40 years. Rosatom, the Russian Federal Agency for Atomic Energy, gives out no info on Bilibino. All we know today is that the plant, vital for the region, is still operational. There is no public data on the warming of the permafrost under the plant and the surrounding town, and even scientists avoid the question.
Unfortunately, I've never been there. There were some problems with the dam. the one that reserves water to cool the reactors. There were apparently problems with the increase in temperature of the permafrost. But I haven't seen any more published on the dam, so I presume it held. It's a dam that was built on permafrost, and it must hold at all costs. We had a little information on the problems with the dam in the early 2000s. Just a couple of mentions. Then nothing more.
Since then, not a single expert or external researcher has been allowed into the plant.
I never met people from Rosatom. Oh, no one measures permafrost there. It's all modeling. It's all modeling. We don't have real data. There is, there's supposed at least to be some organization who monitors temperature, and I'm sure there is one, but it's all classified. We have no idea even who does it because it's classified information.
Should we dismantle all the buildings and work on new projects with different types of foundations, different types of structures, refreezing the soil?
A first solution could be to stop producing nuclear energy in the Arctic, but the very opposite seems to be more likely. Since 2006, Rosatom, Russia's nuclear energy agency, has been developing a floating nuclear plant aimed at providing electricity for all its Arctic projects.
You can't call this construction a ship. Let's just call it an electric plant. On this plant, they're planning to build a depot to stock used nuclear fuel and a depot for supplies of nuclear fuel. That means the plant won't be able to move on its own. And it's also dangerous from a radioactive point of view. It's a fairly expensive plant. A few years ago, construction costs were estimated to be about $500 million, but now we hear the costs keep rising. So the steam and electricity it produces will come at the price of gold.
Rosatom refuses to allow reporters onto the site and systematically refuses any interviews. The only public communication is with films like this one.
Floating nuclear power plants can become the basis for economic growth and a guarantee of safe energy in these regions. These floating nuclear power plants will supply the oil and gas extraction platforms above deposits far offshore with electricity.
I think it could function autonomously for about 9 years. After that, it would need recharging. Once it has used up all of its nuclear fuel, and there's no more room to store the nuclear waste, it would then need to be towed to a place where it could be recharged. But in the meantime, what would become of the site it had been supplying with energy and heating? I think Rosatom has a very strong lobby in the Russian parliament, Senate, and government. How else would it be able to do all this?
I get the feeling that the current big projects for the Arctic are not taking into account what's happening in the world. The Arctic is far away, so people behave like nothing is going on. That's the first point. The second is that the further away we are, the less we're able to realize what has been happening for 10 years. The increase in global warming. And this increase isn't at all foreseen in climate simulation models.
What if Hubert Gallet were right? What if today's models were no longer able to predict the climate changes of tomorrow? Then all the calculations for the big projects in the Arctic would be wrong, and the risks of a disaster would quite simply be incalculable.
No available model is capable, and I stress the word no, of representing what is really happening. We don't know where we're heading. So the question is, where are we heading? Do we continue not caring, like those who want to exploit the Arctic? Or do we start caring? Who knows if politicians will be brave enough? That's not my domain. But will they be brave enough to stare reality in the face? Who knows?
It's not good that the politicians are the ones who are questioned. Each country has its laws, and no individual politician or government has the right to abandon national sovereignty. Public opinion and voters are very finicky on questions of international sovereignty. But national sovereignty has had its day. It's time to leave national sovereignty behind us and go forward as one. First, the electorate must vote for people who will fight for international laws. This nudge from the electorate is what is needed to make politicians take action.
Will this so-called nudge from the electorate be enough? Are politicians still capable of rejecting the demands of the oil majors when the financial returns are so great? To govern for the sake of mankind or for national interests? The fate of the Arctic will depend on this political choice. 25 years ago, the Antarctic, the South Pole, was declared a World Heritage Site. Since then, it has been protected from the covetousness of man. Today, is it too much to ask to offer the same degree of protection to the Arctic?